Hey guys, welcome back. If you're here, you're probably looking for something relaxing to fall asleep to, or maybe just something slow and soothing to wind down your evening. Either way, I've got you covered. Tonight's story takes us back into the winding streets and smoky kitchens of the Middle Ages, where the idea of junk food wasn't just greasy, it was often dangerous, disappointing, or downright disgusting. As always, I love seeing where you're listening from, so feel free to say hi in the comments. Let me know what time it is where you are and how your day went. I read every single one, and I love seeing how far this little sleepy history community stretches across the world. Now, if you enjoy falling asleep to quiet stories like this, you might consider subscribing or liking the video. I don't say that often, but it really helps me know what kind of stories you want more of. Okay, go ahead and get comfortable. Maybe wrap yourself in a blanket and let your mind start to drift. Tonight's journey isn't about kings or castles or grand tournaments. It's about the humble pie stand, the smoky cookshop on the corner, and the mysterious meat skewered over a fire at the local fair. It's about the everyday stuff people ate when they were in a rush, out of money, or just craving something warm and cheap. And spoiler alert, a lot of it kind of sucked. So settle in, take a deep breath, and let's ease into the strange and sometimes stomach-turning world of medieval junk food. Why it existed, what it looked like, and why most of us would not have enjoyed it very much. Let's begin. Picture this. You're walking through a medieval marketplace, maybe somewhere in a damp little town in England. It's chilly. The air smells like wet straw, smoke, and horse manure. Your stomach growls. You haven't eaten all day, and it's not like you can stop by a bakery for a muffin or pop a few coins into a vending machine. No, what you've got in front of you is a wooden stall, a low fire, and a man with grease on his sleeves and soot on his face, selling something he calls a meat pie. Now, in theory, that sounds promising. Meat, after all, is a luxury. A pie? Even better. Something warm, filling, wrapped up in crusty dough. But you see, this is where things start to get a little grim. First of all, the meat in your pie may not actually be meat, and if it is, it's not fresh. Many medieval pie vendors used leftover scraps, bits from animals that had already started to turn, or pieces that were tough, stringy, and nearly impossible to chew. Sometimes, it wasn't even one type of animal. It might be a little pork, a little pigeon, a bit of offal, and something the vendor swears is definitely lamb, but smells suspiciously like rat. Pies weren't refrigerated, of course, and the concept of food safety was a vague idea at best. You were taking a gamble with every bite. But if you were poor, or cold, or just desperate to put something in your belly, you went for it anyway. The crust, meanwhile, was rarely meant to be eaten. Known as a coffin, the pastry was thick, hard, and dry, baked more to protect the contents than to be enjoyed. In wealthier kitchens, servants might eat the crusts after the lords were finished, but on the street, most people tossed it aside, gnawed on it like a bone, or used it as a makeshift bowl. And if you were lucky enough to get a fresh pie, hot from the coals, that didn't guarantee safety either. Medieval pies were often cooked fast and cheap. The outside could be blistering, while the inside was still half raw. The juice would dribble out, stain your tunic, and leave you with a burning tongue and a sinking feeling in your gut that maybe, just maybe, you should have stuck with the barley porridge. Still, meat pies were popular. People needed food that was portable, hearty, and cheap. Vendors shouted their offerings in crowded alleyways, sometimes using spices or herbs to cover up the sour smell of meat going off. A bit of garlic, a pinch of sage, a splash of vinegar. It didn't fix the problem, but it gave the illusion of something edible. In cities like London, attempts were made to regulate this mess. As early as the 13th century, officials tried to inspect pie sellers. There were even punishments for those who sold rotten food, though enforcement was patchy at best. Some vendors simply packed up and moved to a different part of town. One infamous case involved a man selling meat pies that were discovered to contain, well, let's just say, unidentified remains. He was publicly punished and banished, though whether this stopped others from doing the same is doubtful. It's important to remember, though, that for many people, these pies were a lifeline. They were warm, they were filling, and they were better than going hungry. A pie might cost just a penny or two, which made it one of the few fast food options available to workers, beggars, and travellers. You ate it fast, standing up, and hoped it wouldn't turn against you later that night. Of course, not all pies were terrible. In noble houses, meat pies could be elaborate affairs, filled with beef, duck, venison, even fruit or eggs, layered with spices imported from distant lands. But that's not the kind of pie we're talking about tonight. We're talking about the street pie, the greasy, mysterious pocket of medieval misery. So next time you bite into a flaky, buttery pastry filled with fresh ingredients and just the right amount of seasoning, maybe spare a thought for the people of the past. Their version of junk food came with fewer choices, fewer safety standards, and a much higher chance of getting food poisoning. Now, take a deep breath. Let that image fade. The muddy street, the greasy pie vendor, the crust that crumbles in your hand. Let it all go, like steam rising from a cauldron. You're safe now, warm, clean, and nowhere near a 14th century food stall. And with that, we move on. All right? Let's talk about bread. Seems harmless, right? A nice warm loaf, maybe with a bit of butter, maybe dipped into soup. Bread is comfort food. It's simple, dependable, and for most of us today, pretty enjoyable. But in the Middle Ages, bread was less of a comfort and more of a constant culinary gamble. Let's start with this. Almost everyone ate bread, every single day. It was the staple food of Europe for centuries, the foundation of the medieval diet. Rich or poor, merchant or monk, you were going to eat bread, and lots of it. But what kind of bread you ate depended entirely on your status and your wallet. The rich had access to something called manchet bread. This was made with the finest white flour available, sifted many times to remove husks, dirt, and stray pebbles. It was soft, almost cake-like, and baked in professional kitchens by trained cooks. The texture was fluffy, the crust light, and for those lucky enough to taste it, it was one of the few medieval foods that probably wouldn't offend modern palates. But let's be honest, most people didn't eat that kind of bread. Most people got trencher bread, or worse, the dark, heavy loaves made with coarse barley, rye, oats, or a mysterious blend of whatever grains were cheapest that season. And calling it bread might be generous. These loaves were dense, sour, and hard as stone. Some were baked with ground-up beans, lentils, or even acorns when times were especially bad. And then there's the grit. Yes, grit. Small bits of sand and stone were a regular part of poor people's bread, thanks to the way flour was milled. Millstones would shed tiny particles into the flour during grinding, and there wasn't much anyone could do about it. So when you bit into a slice of peasant bread, you weren't just biting into grain, you were also biting into the medieval equivalent of sandpaper. Over time, this wore down people's teeth. Archaeologists often find medieval skeletons with heavily ground down molars, teeth broken from years of chewing through gritty bread. Cavities were common, but so were abscesses, jaw infections, and all the delightful consequences of a life spent chewing rocks in bread form. And it wasn't just the texture. Sometimes the bread was spoiled. Sometimes it was moldy. There are records of bread being stretched with chalk, lime, or clay, especially during periods of famine or grain shortage. Bakers would do what they had to do to meet demand, even if it meant selling something that might make you sick. Even the color of your bread sent a message. White bread was aspirational. It meant you had money, You had access, you had power. Brown bread meant you were just trying to survive. You could be sitting across from someone in church, and the difference between your bread and theirs told the whole story. There were also superstitions around bread. People believed that bread should be crossed with a knife before baking to ward off the devil. Others thought that bread baked during a thunderstorm might turn out cursed. And if your bread didn't rise properly, some might accuse the baker of witchcraft or worse. In towns, bakeries were regulated, at least in theory. Bakers could be fined or even publicly shamed if they were caught shortchanging their customers or using bad flour. Some were made to stand in the stocks with loaves of their bad bread hung around their necks. But again, enforcement varied, and poor people didn't have many options. You bought what was available, and you hoped it wouldn't break a tooth. Still, bread was essential. It filled your belly, it stretched meals, it absorbed broths and meat drippings, and it gave you something to chew when nothing else was around. It was part of every meal, sometimes the entire meal, and for monks and nuns, bread might be all they ate during fasting periods. And yet, despite all its flaws, people found comfort in it. Families passed down their own baking methods. Small villages had favourite bakers, and children still lined up for the warm end pieces just like today. There's something universal about bread, even when it's made of barley husks and stone chips. So the next time you bite into a soft, warm slice of sourdough or tear apart a fresh roll at dinner, take a moment to appreciate the miracle of modern milling. You're not chewing rocks. You're not worried about chalk in your crust. You're just enjoying bread, the way it's supposed to be. Close your eyes now. Imagine the dusty heat of a medieval bakery, the smell of yeast and wood smoke, the clatter of wooden paddles pulling loaves from the oven. Then let it fade away, replaced by silence and the soft rhythm of your breath. No grinding stones here, just peace. And now, we move on. Let's move from bread to something softer, at least in theory. Dairy. It's comforting, creamy, nourishing. A bowl of warm milk before bed, a slice of cheese with fruit, a bit of butter on toast. In the modern world, dairy is often a symbol of home and simplicity. But in the medieval world, it was a bit more complicated. Milk didn't last long. In a time before refrigeration, it was a race against the clock. You had to milk the cow, goat, or sheep, and use it quickly, or watch it turn sour within hours. And yes, sour milk was often still consumed. People didn't waste much, especially not something as valuable as animal milk. It would be curdled, mixed, warmed, or turned into something else. But it wasn't always pleasant. Milk was seen as both nourishing and risky. Physicians of the day, working with a mix of ancient Greek theory and medieval observation, warned that milk could cause phlegm, sluggishness, or even digestive troubles. If you were sick, you were often advised to avoid milk, especially if it had been sitting out for too long. Even healthy milk came with issues. Cleanliness was a problem. Buckets were reused, animals weren't always healthy, and milking was often done quickly, in barns filled with dust and flies. It was easy for milk to become contaminated, and once it started to go bad, it didn't just sour. It curdled, clotted, turned chunky and acidic. And yet, that was often the beginning of another product entirely. Cheese. Now, cheese was more stable than milk, which made it valuable. It was a way to preserve milk for days, weeks, even months, depending on the climate and method. But medieval cheese was not always the smooth, aged wheel you might imagine. It was often sharp, rough, and inconsistent. Sometimes it was soft and moist, other times dry and salty, crumbling at the touch. Poorer communities made fresh cheeses, sometimes daily, from skimmed milk or leftover curds. These cheeses went bad fast. If you didn't eat them within a couple of days, they'd take on a smell, then a taste, then a colour that you probably wouldn't want to describe. There were no labels, no expiration dates. You learned by experience. Some cheeses were intentionally left to ferment in caves, wrapped in cloth, or buried in ash to protect them from insects. These processes could create edible, even delicious cheese. Or they could result in something that tasted like moldy socks dipped in vinegar. Then there was butter, highly prized, especially in Northern Europe, where cows were more common. Butter was expensive and often saved for special occasions or religious fasting periods when meat was off the table. But again, it spoiled quickly. Summer butter, in particular, was notoriously unstable, turning soft and rancid in the heat. People tried to preserve it with salt or herbs, but if you weren't lucky, your butter might smell more like cheese than cream. In monasteries and noble households, dairy was handled more carefully. There were dedicated workers who churned, strained, and aged their products. Some monasteries even developed their own cheese recipes, guarded and passed down like treasure. These cheeses might still have been pungent and strange to modern tastes, but at least they were intentional. For most people, though, dairy was another gamble. A bowl of warm milk might soothe your stomach, or it might send you running for the privy. A chunk of cheese might be nourishing, or it might be crawling with something extra. Still, dairy filled bellies. It added richness to bread, softened porridge, and made the harshness of grain-based meals a little more bearable. Even so, some people avoided it altogether. Lactose intolerance isn't a modern phenomenon. Many medieval people, especially adults, likely lacked the enzymes to comfortably digest dairy. They didn't know the science behind it, but they knew the feeling. And if you'd ever had a bad experience with spoiled milk, that memory probably lingered longer than the taste. Despite the risks, dairy remained part of daily life. Children were raised on it. Monks measured it carefully. Peasants bartered it. And in cities, vendors sold cheese by the hunk, sometimes covered in cloth to keep off the flies. Whether you liked it or not, it was everywhere. So tonight, as you sip something warm or nibble a midnight snack, give thanks for pasteurization, for fridges, for quality control, and for the comforting certainty that your cheese won't try to bite back. Now take a slow breath. Let the scent of old barns, musty cheese, and sour milk drift away like a breeze through the fields. Let it fade. All that remains is stillness, and the gentle quiet of history drifting into sleep. Let's continue. So far, we've explored bread that could break your jaw, pies with mysterious fillings, and dairy that walked a fine line between food and biohazard. But maybe you're wondering, what about something sweet? Surely, with all that heaviness, people in the Middle Ages had desserts, right? Some little treat at the end of a hard day. A chewy caramel, a bit of chocolate, a sugar cookie perhaps? Well, not quite. You see, the idea of candy, as we know it today, barely existed in medieval Europe. Sugar itself was a luxury. Imported at great cost from faraway places like the Middle East or India, sugar was stored and used like medicine. Apothecaries sold it by the pinch, and it was often prescribed to patients as a digestive aid or energizing tonic. For the average person, it was more fantasy than food. Instead, if you wanted something sweet, you had to get creative. Honey was the go-to sweetener. It was local, it was natural, and in the right season, it was plentiful. Honey was stirred into gruels, smeared on bread, or used to coat nuts and dried fruits. Some clever cooks even used honey to preserve petals, making little rose-scented treats or candied violets. Sounds lovely, right? Except, raw honey wasn't always filtered. It sometimes came with bits of wax, dead bees, or chunks of comb. It could be gritty, smoky, even a little sour depending on where the bees had been foraging. Still, it was the best most people had, and they made do with it. Then there were fruit pastes. Imagine cooking down apples or plums into a thick, sticky mash, drying it in the sun, and slicing it into leathery slabs. That was the medieval version of a fruit snack. Sometimes spices were added, like cinnamon or ginger, but again, only if you could afford them. Marzipan was a rare luxury, made from ground almonds and sugar, molded into little shapes like birds or castles. But unless you were part of the nobility, marzipan wasn't something you ever tasted. It was the kind of thing that appeared at royal banquets, not village fairs. Then there were the candied spices. Bits of ginger root, anise, or even peppercorns were boiled in syrup and dried. These were considered both delicious and medicinal. People believed they helped with digestion, especially after a heavy feast. But they weren't sweet in the way we think of candy. They were spicy, chewy, sometimes harsh on the tongue. A handful of candied fennel seeds might freshen your breath, or it might just confuse your taste buds entirely. One of the strangest sweets of all was something called sucket. This was essentially preserved fruit in thick syrup, sometimes wine, soaked, sometimes spiced. Wealthy households served it at the end of meals, scooping out bits of candied orange peel or sugared quince from glass jars. Again, it sounds charming. But imagine this being made without refrigeration, in a kitchen full of flies, and you start to understand why it wasn't always so delightful. And we haven't even gotten to the colour. In modern candy, we take bright colours for granted. Pinks, blues, yellows. In medieval sweets, colouring was often done with natural and sometimes questionable ingredients. Beet juice for red, saffron for yellow, ground herbs or berries for green. Sometimes the colour didn't match the flavour at all, and sometimes it just didn't work. You might bite into something expecting a sweet taste, and end up chewing on a clove-infused dough ball that made your eyes water. Also, medieval sweets didn't come wrapped. They didn't have little plastic trays or wax paper. Everything was handmade, and usually eaten quickly before it spoiled. If you bought something sweet from a market stall, it was likely sticky, dropped into your hand without ceremony, and already melting a little from the sun. And yet, people loved sweets. They were rare, special, and carried emotional weight. A sweet treat might be saved for a festival, a wedding, or the return of a loved one from war. Monks sometimes made special honey cakes for feast days. Children waited all year for sugared bread rolls at certain holidays. Even if the taste wasn't always great, the meaning was. So no, medieval candy wasn't sweet in the way we know it. It didn't have smooth chocolate or fizzy centers, or satisfyingly crisp coatings. But it carried the same sense of joy, the same role as a small reward at the end of a hard season, a flicker of comfort in a hard world. As you lie there, let yourself drift. Imagine a quiet medieval kitchen, lit by firelight, the smell of apples and honey hanging in the air. A child reaches out, sticky fingers grasping a homemade sweet. There is laughter, then silence, then peace. You can let that go now. You're not in the sticky heat of a medieval summer. You're here, calm, clean, and warm. Let's move on. You're walking through a medieval town again, the sun low in the sky, your throat dry and your feet tired. You pass a public fountain, hear the splash of water, and think maybe, just maybe, a cold drink would make things better. But in the Middle Ages, that decision wasn't so simple. Let's talk about what people drank, and more importantly, what they avoided. Starting with water. It seems strange now, but water was often seen as suspicious, even dangerous. Not because people knew about bacteria or contamination in a modern sense, but because they noticed patterns. People who drank from certain wells got sick. People who filled their cups from the river sometimes died. So, over time, water became something to treat with caution, unless it came from a clear spring or was boiled first, which rarely happened unless you were already making soup or brewing something else. Urban water sources, especially, were a gamble. Towns and cities didn't have proper sewage systems, and animal waste, human waste, and rotting garbage often found their way into rivers and wells. A bucket of water might look clean, but smell faintly of fish, mold, or worse. So what did people drink instead? The answer almost always, was ale. Not beer, exactly, and certainly not anything hoppy or cold. Medieval ale was often low in alcohol, thick, cloudy, and warm. It was made with barley or oats, sometimes flavored with herbs or spices, and it was brewed quickly. Most of it was consumed within a few days of being made. It didn't travel well, and it didn't store for long, but it had one big advantage over water. It had been boiled. The brewing process killed off most of the harmful bacteria, which made ale one of the safest drinks around. Even children drank it, even monks on fast days. Ale was a daily drink, not a luxury or a party beverage. Some households brewed their own. Others bought it from local alewives, women who made their living by brewing small batches and selling them door to door or from stalls. These alewives were often respected, sometimes feared, occasionally accused of watering down their product or charging unfair prices. Local governments even set price limits on ale, and inspectors, known as ale tasters, were sent to test the quality and strength. Not a bad job if you could get it. If you were wealthier, you might drink wine, especially in southern parts of Europe, but wine came with its own problems. It could turn sour quickly, and sometimes sellers added herbs, ashes, or even lead to improve the taste. Sweet wines were prized, but expensive. Most people never got near them. Cider and mead were also available in some regions. Cider, made from apples, was more common in places where grapes didn't grow well. Mead, a fermented drink made from honey, was often reserved for feasts or ceremonies. It was sweet, strong, and a bit mysterious. Even today, it carries a sense of old magic, the kind of drink served in carved wooden cups by firelight. There were also some strange and forgotten drinks. Possets, for instance, made with warm milk and ale, or herbal infusions made from boiled water and leaves like early tea. People drank these for health, comfort, or as part of rituals. But again, only if you could afford the ingredients. And in monasteries, the drinks became more refined. Monks experimented with distillation, early versions of spirits, and flavored liqueurs. Some of the beverages we know today began in these quiet stone cloisters, passed from monk to monk in flickering candlelight. Still, for most people, every sip was a balance between thirst and risk. A drink could refresh you, or it could ruin your week. And sometimes, you didn't know until the next morning. Imagine being a farmer, returning from the fields, muddy to the knees, holding a rough wooden mug. You take a long drink of warm, slightly sour ale. It doesn't taste great, but it's safe. It's familiar. It does the job. You lean back against a haystack and let the exhaustion wash over you. As you lie there now, listening, picture that mug, the weight of it in your hand, the smell of barley, the faint sweetness of something fermented, and then let it drift away. Let the thirst be quenched. Let the uncertainty of the past fade into the stillness of the present. You're safe here. You know what's in your cup. Let's keep going. In the narrow alleys behind medieval marketplaces, beyond the shouting vendors and clatter of cartwheels, you might find a smell rising above the rest. It was sharp, heavy, unmistakable. The smell of something frying. In a world of pottage and porridge, fried food was something different. It sizzled, it smoked, it promised richness and warmth in a way few other things could. But like many promises in the Middle Ages, this one came with consequences. Frying required fat, and fat wasn't cheap. Animal lard was the most common choice. Cows, pigs, even geese could be rendered down, their fat collected and stored in pots to be reused again and again. Butter was another option, but only in regions where it was abundant and only for those who could spare it. Olive oil was prized, rare, and mostly used in the Mediterranean. So for most street cooks, frying was a messy, smelly, and very greasy affair. Now imagine the tools. There were no deep fryers, No thermometers, no precise methods, just open flames, blackened pans, and centuries of trial and error. Some vendors fried over coals, others over wood fires, balancing hot iron skillets on bricks or grates. And the oil? It was reused until it turned dark, sticky, and pungent. Filtering was minimal, if it happened at all. Bits of batter, crumbs, and meat scraps collected in the bottom and burned into the next batch. It gave everything a distinctive flavour, one that wasn't always welcome. But still, people came for fried food. It was fast, it was filling, and it could turn the cheapest ingredients into something that at least looked appetizing. One of the most common offerings was fried dough. Simple batter made from flour and water, maybe with a pinch of salt or a dash of ale, dropped into hot fat until puffed and golden. Some called it fritters, others used local names, but the idea was the same. Crispy on the outside, chewy on the inside, hot enough to burn your fingers. If you were lucky, the fritters had something inside, a bit of cheese, a sliver of apple, or a spoonful of mashed peas. But more often, they were empty. Just fried air and dough, eaten quickly before the grease cooled and the texture turned to rubber. Meat was also fried, though rarely the cuts we'd want today. Tough scraps, bits of organ meat, or pieces too small for roasting were tossed in flour and plunged into boiling fat. The result was chewy, uneven, and often overcooked on the outside while raw in the middle. But to a hungry traveller or a tired labourer, it was better than nothing. In wealthier homes, frying took on a more refined form. Recipes survive that describe sweet fritters filled with almond paste, fish fried with herbs and vinegar, or even delicate pancakes made with rosewater. But these were special dishes, made for feast days, or served in the homes of nobles. Most people didn't taste them. Most people got the scraps. The smell of frying lingered. It clung to clothes, seeped into thatched roofs, drifted down the alleys long after the cook fires died. It was a smell that promised food, but also warned of danger. Grease fires were common, pans tipped, children burned their fingers, and yet the frying continued, day after day, in corners and courtyards all across Europe. Cleanliness, again, was questionable. Fried food vendors often worked with little water, reusing their tools and never fully cleaning them. The oil, dark and slick, was stored in jars and reused until it was more sludge than liquid. If someone dropped a spoon or a skewer, they picked it back up, wiped it on a sleeve, and kept going. And there was something else fried too. Insects. Not everywhere, and not all the time, but in some places, fried bugs were part of the local food landscape. Beetles, crickets, and other small creatures, tossed in fat for a crunchy, salty snack. To the modern mind, it might seem strange, but in a world where protein was scarce and hunger constant, nothing went to waste. Despite all this, fried food remained popular. It was festive. It crackled. It felt indulgent, even when it wasn't. During carnivals or feast days, entire streets filled with the sound of frying and the smell of grease. People gathered, ate with their hands, wiped their mouths on sleeves, and moved on. So next time you bite into something golden and crispy, remember that frying has always been messy, always been imperfect, but always tempting. Now let the image fade. Let the fire die down. Let the heavy scent of old oil dissolve into silence. The alley is empty now. The vendors are gone. The grease has cooled. Time to rest. Somewhere near the heart of a medieval town, just past the butchers and bakehouses, was a narrow stall with hooks hanging from the rafters. Coils of something dark and shiny twisted above a wooden board. The smell was unmistakable. Rich, fatty, spiced, and just slightly suspicious. It was sausage. Sausages in the Middle Ages were everywhere, yet nowhere near what we expect today. There was no refrigeration, no factory casing, no standardized seasoning. Instead, sausage making was a chaotic, improvised craft, somewhere between preservation method and culinary gamble. At its most basic, a medieval sausage was a way to use everything. Every scrap of meat left on the bone, every chunk too small for a stew, every sinewy bit of tendon or organ meat that no one wanted on its own. These were chopped, minced with knives, or crushed with stones, then stuffed by hand into cleaned animal intestines, tied off with string, and hung to dry, smoke, or cook. But meat wasn't the only thing inside. To stretch the filling, makers added breadcrumbs, lentils, or even mashed vegetables, sometimes dried fruit, especially in wealthier homes. Spices, when available, masked the less pleasant aromas. Salt helped keep the sausage from spoiling too quickly. Garlic, pepper, sage, coriander, mustard seed, even ground juniper might find their way inside. But the balance wasn't always right. One sausage might be delicious, the next revolting. And storage? That's where the gamble came in. Without modern preservation, sausages had to be eaten quickly, smoked over coals, or heavily salted. Otherwise, they turned. Some turned fast. A sausage hung in the wrong corner, in the wrong weather, would begin to swell, leak, and eventually split with a soft, unpleasant pop. Some vendors tried to mask the smell by frying them in heavy oil. Others claimed that a bit of sourness was a good sign. A little aged, they said, adds flavor. Of course, this wasn't always true. There are records of food poisoning outbreaks linked to sausages. People who fell ill hours after eating one. Those who recovered swore off meat entirely. Others weren't so lucky. In one infamous case, a bishop's household was brought to a halt after a badly handled sausage sent a dozen servants to their beds. In another, a cook was fined and whipped for feeding soldiers spoiled meat wrapped in sausage skin. Still, sausage endured. It was easy to carry. You could slice it into a stew, cook it over a fire, or eat it cold with a hunk of bread. In festivals, sausages were grilled on skewers, served with onion or greens. Travelling knights might keep dried sausage in their saddlebags. Peasants shared them on long harvest days, slicing thin coins off a shared coil. And yes, not all of them were bad. Some towns gained reputations for their sausages. Local recipes passed down for generations. A secret spice blend, a particular wood used for smoking, a method of drying just right. In these places, sausage became pride. But even there, the risks remained. Casing was fragile. Breaks meant air got in. Air meant spoilage. And in the wrong season, insects arrived. Flies laid eggs inside poorly stored sausages. Maggots followed. It sounds grotesque now, but back then, people sometimes ate around the problem. Cut the clean end. Hope for the best. The texture was unpredictable too. Some were chewy, others dry and hard. You might bite down and feel something snap, or worse, something squish. Bits of bone were not uncommon. Neither were gristle or the occasional piece of tooth if the butcher had worked too fast. And yet, sausage was beloved. It was festive, it was filling, and above all, it was familiar. Families had their own ways of making them, even if the results were uneven. A grandmother might whisper her preferred seasoning. A boy might remember the smell of his father's sausage frying on winter mornings. These memories lingered longer than the taste. So if you find yourself today slicing into a clean, even, mildly spiced sausage, give a little nod to those who came before. The ones who chewed carefully, ate gratefully, and sometimes took a risk with every bite. And now, let that image dissolve. The smoke curling from a market grill, the hiss of fat dripping into flame, the coil of meat swaying gently on its hook. Let the sounds fall quiet. Let the smells fade. Just the soft hush of night now, and a full stomach. Let's move on. Salt. It seems simple enough. A sprinkle on your fries, a dash in your soup, a staple in every kitchen cabinet. But in the medieval world, salt wasn't just a seasoning. It was survival. Salt preserved, salt protected, Salt kept fish edible, meat from rotting, and butter from going rancid. Without it, the entire rhythm of the food supply collapsed. But as vital as it was, salt also made everything taste like salt, and sometimes like stone. The first problem was access. Salt had to be mined or evaporated from seawater. It was laborious, time-consuming, and expensive. Inland towns paid dearly for it, and merchants guarded it like treasure. In some places, it was so valuable that it was used as currency. Soldiers were paid in salt, fines were levied in salt. Whole cities rose and fell depending on who controlled the salt trade. For the wealthy, this meant salt cellars filled with fine white crystals, served in little bowls beside roasted meats or sprinkled across delicate cheese. But for everyone else, it meant coarse, grey, mineral-heavy chunks hacked from barrels and scraped over food with a knife. There was nothing subtle about it. Preservation was the main goal. Salted fish, salted pork, salted beef. These items weren't flavoured so much as embalmed. A ham might be soaked in brine for days, then hung to dry in a smoky loft. When finally cooked, it was hard, salty, and needed to be boiled several times just to make it chewable. The salt cut through the muscle, shrank the flesh, and sometimes changed the colour entirely. A pink salt beef might look delicious from a distance, but taste like seawater-soaked bark up close. Even bread wasn't safe. In some regions, salt was added to the dough not just for taste, but to help it keep longer, and the result was often a hard, briny crust with a dense centre that pulled moisture from your mouth. Cheese, too, was heavily salted, sometimes overly so, especially when aged in dry, crumbling slabs, the kind of cheese that left your lips dry and your tongue thirsty. And what about vegetables? When they were available, they were often boiled with salted meats or stewed in briny broths. By the time a cabbage made it to your plate, it had absorbed every salty note from the pot. Even eggs, preserved in brine or packed in salted ashes, emerged tasting more like the barrel than the bird. This wasn't done out of choice. It was necessity. Salt meant survival through winter. Salt meant food on a rainy day. Salt meant not dying of hunger in a time before fridges, vacuum seals, or even airtight jars. But there was a cost. The salt crept into everything. It made food monotonous. It masked subtleties. It dulled the senses over time. There are accounts of travellers writing home about how every dish in a new town tasted the same. Salt pork, salt fish, salt stew, salted butter on salted bread. It also affected health. Though people didn't understand sodium the way we do now, they felt the consequences. Salt made you thirsty. It dried your mouth, tightened your joints, sometimes left you dizzy in summer. Those who could afford fresh meat or vegetables prized them not just for their nutrition, but for the relief they gave the tongue. In cities, salt was controlled by guilds and taxes. Smuggling was common. So was fraud. Some vendors sold sand mixed with salt, or reused brine from spoiled barrels. A herring soaked in recycled brine might look normal, but the taste betrayed its history. People got sick. Some went blind. Others simply accepted it as part of life. In monasteries, monks developed more careful methods. They monitored salt levels in recipes. They experimented with pickling and drying. Some monasteries became known for their salted goods, exporting barrels of fish or ham to distant markets. But even these products, lovingly made, still bore that same heavy weight of preservation. And so, salt became a quiet burden, always present, always needed, but never celebrated. So tonight, as you drift off, think of that ham hanging in the rafters, beads of brine forming on its skin. Picture the cellar full of barrels, the sharp tang of salt in the air. Picture the weary cook, rubbing crystals into meat, knowing it would last another week, another month, another winter. And now let it fade. Let the brine drain away. Let the dryness leave your mouth. You are here, not there. Your food is fresh. Your water is clean. Time to rest. The medieval marketplace was a living thing. It breathed through noise and motion, sweat and smoke. Carts rattled over uneven stones. Voices rose in haggling chants, and every breath of air carried the scent of something sometimes enticing, sometimes alarming. But within this chaos lay one of the most uncertain aspects of daily life: buying food. There were no ingredient labels, no printed expiration dates, no scales with digital precision. If you bought food, you did it on faith or instinct or desperation. And more often than not, you hoped you wouldn't regret it later. The market opened early. Vendors set up before sunrise, spreading their goods on wooden tables, cloth mats, or directly onto the ground. Meat was often laid out in the open, glistening in the sun, buzzing with flies. A good cut might come from the morning slaughter. A bad one might be yesterday's leftovers, rinsed and rubbed with herbs to mask the smell. Some butchers prided themselves on quality, but others worked quickly, slicing and trimming with little care. You might buy a hunk of beef that looked fine, only to find the center grey and sour. There was no way to know. Vendors swore their goods were fresh, always. And when pressed, they might offer a shrug, a charm, or a story about how the weather had simply made things look different today. Fishmongers had their own tricks. Salted fish was common, but fresh fish now that was rare and risky. A fish might look firm and bright, but a poke with the finger revealed softness, a turned eye, a sour scent rising from the gills. Still, it might be all that was available. People made do. Eggs were another mystery. A basket of them might seem fine, but without modern refrigeration, one rotten egg could spoil a dozen. Shaking an egg by your ear became a strange ritual. If it sloshed, it was probably bad. If it was silent, maybe it was safe. Or maybe not. Some boiled their eggs immediately. Others buried them in ash or straw to stretch their life, not always successfully. Vegetables came with fewer dangers, but their quality varied wildly. Root vegetables pulled from the ground still clung to dirt. Leaves wilted in the sun. Apples had bruises. Onions were soft in the center. You picked carefully, hoping to find the one cabbage that hadn't gone mushy inside. Then there were the vendors of prepared foods. Breads, stews, pies. The things you bought hot and ate with your hands, standing beneath an awning while smoke curled around your face. These were the true gamble. There were no health inspections, no hairnets, no running water. A cook might stir stew with a spoon that had just fallen to the floor. A meat pie might be filled with scraps swept off the table from the day before. Some cooks added ash to thicken soup, or flour to mask the sourness of milk. Others reused grease until it bubbled with dark froth. And yet, people bought, ate, and returned. Trust was everything. Some vendors built reputations that lasted generations. You knew the baker who didn't stretch his dough too thin. You remembered the fish seller who salted her herring just right. Word spread fast. So did suspicion. There were rumors of poisoned wine, of old pork disguised as lamb, of bread made with ground chalk to stretch the flour. Sometimes these tales were true. Other times, they were just ways to discredit a rival vendor. Either way, the customer was left guessing. Prices fluctuated too. On market day, the crowd was thick and prices went up. On rainy days, vendors grew desperate and bargains appeared. But a cheap sausage might come at a cost. A discount on stew could mean it was the third time it had been reheated. People developed a kind of sixth sense, balancing cost, hunger, and risk. Even the weights used were suspect. Vendors kept stones and balances at their stalls, but some carved theirs slightly smaller than standard. A loaf of bread weighed light. A wedge of cheese looked generous, but was hollow at its center. The difference wasn't much, but across hundreds of sales, it added up. And yet, for all its flaws, the market was essential. It was where people gathered, where news spread, where you might see old friends or enemies, and where every transaction was a small act of faith. Faith in the seller, faith in the food. Faith that your instincts would serve you better than the smell of fish ever could. So now, imagine the clamour quieting. The last vendor folds up their cloth, the flies drift away, the stones of the street are damp from a passing shower, and the market empties into evening. You are no longer holding a bruised pear, no longer squinting at a suspicious slab of pork. You are far from there. Let the noise go. Let the smells fade. Let the gamble pass. Let's move on. Close your eyes and picture a royal banquet. The great hall glows with torchlight, long tables groan under silver platters, roasted peacocks shimmer with their feathers still attached, and servants glide through the crowd in perfect rhythm. It all looks magnificent. But if you were sitting at one of those tables, with a wooden spoon in one hand and an aching stomach in the other, you might quickly discover a truth that rarely makes it into the stories. Most of it didn't taste good. Medieval feasts were more about appearance than pleasure. They were performances, political displays, elaborate games of wealth and power. What mattered wasn't how the food tasted, but how it looked, how rare the ingredients were, how extravagant the preparation appeared to the guests. The taste came second, if it came at all. Take the roasted peacock, for example. It was skinned before cooking, then roasted, then dressed again in its original skin and feathers, so it looked as though it had never died. The result was visually stunning. The meat, however, was stringy, dry, and nearly inedible. Peacocks were tough birds, closer in texture to overcooked turkey than anything tender. But it was a statement. You served a peacock not because it tasted good, but because it said, "Look what I can afford to waste." There were pies with live birds hidden inside, so that when the crust was cut, sparrows or doves flew out into the air. There were sugar sculptures shaped like castles, trees, or saints, coloured with saffron and beetroot juice, and served as centerpieces that no one dared eat. There were fish made to look like other animals, or boars stuffed with geese, stuffed with rabbits, an edible illusion built entirely for spectacle. And spices. Spices were a currency of their own. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, mace, saffron, ginger, pepper. They didn't just flavour food, they proved your reach. If your banquet included a sauce made with pepper from India, or a pudding laced with real sugar from Cyprus, that said more about your status than anything written in a scroll. But used without restraint, those spices could overwhelm. A dish might be so full of cinnamon and vinegar that it masked any trace of the meat beneath. Sweet sauces were poured over fish. Chicken might be dyed green or yellow. Bread was soaked in almond milk until it collapsed into mush, then moulded into shapes to amuse the guests. This was not food meant to comfort, it was food meant to dazzle. Even the eating was part of the act. Nobles didn't just tuck in. They were watched as they dipped fingers into perfumed water between courses, wiped their hands on embroidered napkins, and ate in careful, graceful bites. Sometimes they didn't eat at all. A dish might be passed around, admired, sniffed, praised, and then quietly taken away untouched. To be seen refusing a plate politely was, in some circles, considered more fashionable than actually enjoying it. And the portions? Uneven. While lords and ladies were served elaborate morsels from silver dishes, the lower guests at the table, the squires and lesser nobles, might receive watery stew or coarse bread. Those in the kitchens, the servants who prepared it all, usually ate leftovers hours later, cold and stripped of anything valuable. But perhaps the greatest illusion of the feast was its promise of abundance. These events gave the appearance of endless plenty, but they didn't last. The boar was not cooked for every night. The sugar sculptures were not recreated for daily meals. For most of the year, even nobles ate simpler fare, not so different from what their servants had. Lent alone stripped the tables bare of meat and dairy for weeks. The feast was a moment of escape, not a reflection of reality. And still, people remembered them. Chroniclers wrote pages describing every course. Poets sang of the golden birds and jeweled cakes. Guests carried tales of the feast across kingdoms, inflating them with each retelling. The food didn't need to taste good, it only needed to impress. So the next time you see a film showing kings dining on endless delicacies, or a painting filled with glowing dishes and overflowing goblets, remember that behind the shimmer was often dryness, sourness, and confusion. 100 flavors that clashed, food too rich to eat, too strange to enjoy. Now let the noise of the feast fade. The clatter of knives, the echo of laughter, the smoke of overcooked goose. Let it all quiet. The great hall empties, the torches dim. The peacock feathers fold back into the shadows. You are not there now. You are not performing. No one is watching your plate. Let the illusion dissolve. And let us continue. In a year defined by toil, hunger, and repetition, medieval festivals were a break in the rhythm. A day, or sometimes several, when the plough was left in the field, the market closed early, and the village square filled with colour, sound, and the rare promise of indulgence. The food changed too. It became brighter, richer, louder. But behind the banners and bonfires, the festive table often came with consequences. Festival food was meant to impress, but it wasn't built to last. It was thrown together fast, sometimes with ingredients that had been hoarded for weeks. The goal was abundance, or the illusion of it, and if that meant overcooking, undercooking, or mixing together foods that shouldn't mix, so be it. The frying pans came out first. Cooks lined the streets, pouring batter into bubbling oil, shouting over the crackle. Fritters were everywhere. Some sweet, made from apples or pears or honey-soaked bread. Some savoury, filled with cheese or onions or mashed peas. The batter was unpredictable, the oil reused all day. The result was hot, crispy, and often delicious for the first bite, but the second bite revealed a mouthful of grease, and the third sat in your stomach like a stone. Roasted meats were the centerpiece. A whole pig, sometimes turned on a spit in the town square. Chickens cooked over open flames. Pigeons, if someone had caught enough, boiled and fried and served with herbs. But the meat wasn't always fresh. The rush of the festival meant that anything available was cooked, whether it had been butchered that morning or found at the back of the larder. And sweets. At no other time of year did the village see so much sugar and spice, or at least their cheaper substitutes. Honey cakes shaped like animals, sticky buns filled with nuts or dried fruit, candied fennel seeds wrapped in parchment, all bright, enticing, and cloying by the end of the day. The sweetness dulled the tongue, the heaviness followed close behind. Then came the drinks. Ale flowed freely, sometimes watered down, sometimes not. Cider, cloudy and tart, passed from hand to hand. A mulled wine or two might appear, heavy with cloves and citrus peel. For one day, even children drank more than they should. The celebrations grew louder, and the food less safe as the day wore on. In some places, festival dishes involved raw or barely cooked ingredients. Eggs cracked into stews and served soft. Cheese left warming in the sun. Milk curdled and turned into impromptu sauces. No one had the time to watch the fire carefully. The cooks were distracted, the guests too eager. And yet, people ate with both hands. They hadn't tasted meat in weeks. They hadn't touched sweets in months. They ate until they were dizzy, until the sun slipped behind the trees, until their stomachs groaned and their breath soured. There were regrets, always. Children woke in the night with bellyaches. Elders clutched at their sides and blamed the ale. The village priest might give a sermon the next morning about restraint. But during the festival, restraint was forgotten. Some of the foods were symbolic. Round loaves of bread shaped like suns to celebrate solstices. Spiced puddings made for saints' days. Tiny pies served to children, meant to bring luck, but often filled with little more than mashed turnip and dry herbs. These foods were offered with meaning and swallowed with effort. And there were regional quirks. In some towns, eel was the delicacy. In others, a fermented porridge passed around in wooden bowls. Some villages had special dumplings made once a year, with fillings that changed depending on what had been gathered or trapped that season. A lucky handful might bite into something tender. Others found bone, rind, or something too mysterious to name. But people remembered the festivals fondly, not for the taste, but for the joy, for the laughter, for the freedom to be full, even just once. The food was secondary. It was part of the spell. So now, picture the torches flickering, the tables scattered with crumbs, the children asleep in corners, sticky fingers curled. The music has faded. The pots are cooling. The regret has not yet arrived. Let it all fade. Let the crowd disappear. Let the night take the smells of frying and roasting and sweet bread and carry them far away from you. You are not there. You are resting. Still. Light. Let's continue. The road stretched endlessly, a ribbon of dirt and stone winding through forest, village and field. For the medieval traveller, it was a path filled with risk. Bandits, bad weather, blisters. But hunger, too, followed close behind. And when the stomach growled and the sun began to sink, roadside food stalls seemed like salvation. They rarely were. Travellers were many. Merchants heading to town, pilgrims on sacred journeys, messengers, soldiers, wandering monks, all walked, sometimes for days, with little on their backs. And when they reached the outskirts of a village, or came upon a crossroads inn, they hoped for a warm meal. What they found was often lukewarm at best, and dangerous at worst. These roadside vendors weren't regulated. They worked with what they had, which was usually not much. A pot, a pan, a fire pit ringed with stones. Food was prepared fast, in bulk, with cheap ingredients. Nothing fancy, nothing fresh. The most common offering was stale bread. Hard, dry, cut into thin slices and sometimes rubbed with garlic, or dipped quickly in broth to soften it. If you were lucky, the broth was warm. If not, the bread just became soggy and sour. Some vendors added salt or bits of dried herbs to mask the age. Others sold it as is. You chewed, you swallowed, and you hoped your teeth survived. Then came the dried fish. Often cod or herring, these were salted weeks ago, maybe even months, and laid over a smoky fire to rehydrate just enough for chewing. But many were too far gone. The salt crystallized on the surface. The flesh flaked away. A strong wind could carry the smell down the entire road. Still, travelers bought them. Wrapped in cloth, carried in a pouch, they were better than nothing. But they rarely sat well in the stomach. Some vendors offered soups. A thin, watery pottage made from lentils or barley. Bits of carrot floated in it, maybe a scrap of meat, if the vendor was generous or careless. But the pot had boiled all day, over and over. The flavors mingled into something grey and muddy. The spoon they handed you might not have been washed since the morning, or at all. Meat pies appeared too, small, hand-sized, wrapped in tough crusts. Easy to hold, easy to eat while walking, but the fillings were mysteries. Some tasted of onion and pepper, others of old lamb, or something closer to goat. Sometimes the meat had turned. A sharp tang in the first bite told you to stop. Most didn't. You were hungry. You kept eating. Eggs boiled in soot-black kettles were sold by the pair, often overcooked, rubbery, or undercooked, and leaking yolk. You cracked the shell and prayed for no green ring around the center. Vendors might rub ashes on them to keep flies away, or stack them in straw to keep warm. Either way, they tasted of smoke or fire or something metallic that lingered long after you walked on. The worst was stew that had sat too long, reheated 3, 4, 5 times, new bits added to the old, bones still floating from yesterday's dinner. A traveller might stop in the evening, ladle up a bowl, and not realize until too late that the meat inside had been brought back from the edge more than once. It filled you, yes, but later, when the cramps started, you remembered the taste with regret. And there was no recourse. You couldn't complain. You couldn't get a refund. You paid, you ate, you moved on. If you were lucky, the next day was better. If not, you kept walking, doubled over with stomach pain, looking for a bush and some privacy. Some inns were better. A warm corner, a thick blanket, bread with real butter. But they were few and expensive. Most travellers ate from roadside stalls because they had no choice. And the vendors knew this. They made what sold, what filled the gut, not what satisfied the tongue. So the next time you grab a gas station snack, wrapped in plastic and marked half off, think of the man by the road with his greasy pot and 3 hard eggs, the woman flipping burnt fritters over smoky coals, the monk chewing dry bread while praying not to vomit before the next milestone. Let those images drift. Let the dust of the road settle. The food is gone now. Your stomach is quiet. The fire beside the road has turned to embers, and the traveller is asleep. Let's keep going. The smell hits first. Smoky, sharp, and almost appealing. In the corner of a crowded medieval marketplace, a man stands by a low fire, tending to a row of skewers. Bits of meat sizzle over the flames, fat dripping into the coals, sending up curls of smoke. It looks promising, simple, honest. But behind the char and the smoke, these skewers tell a very different story. Meat skewers were among the most common and tempting street foods of the Middle Ages. Easy to prepare, cheap to sell, and fast to eat. No bowls, no bread, just a wooden stick and a handful of fire. To the hungry townsfolk or weary traveller, they were the perfect meal. Except they weren't. The meat used for these skewers was rarely fresh. Often, it was the trimmings left behind from the butcher's block. Bits of gristle, sinew, and chunks of fat still clinging to small slivers of muscle. Nothing was wasted. Old stew meat, pieces scraped from bone, even questionable cuts that had already begun to smell sour, were sliced thin and skewered tight. Vendors sometimes marinated the meat overnight. Not for flavour, but to soften it and mask its condition. Vinegar, garlic, salt, maybe a bit of ale. Enough to confuse the nose and give the impression of seasoning. Some brushed the skewers with old fat or oil, adding gloss to otherwise dry and shriveled meat. Then came the fire. The open flame did the rest. The outside charred quickly. Smoke curled up, scenting the air, bringing customers closer. But the inside remained uncertain. If the fire was too hot, the outside burned before the center cooked through. If the fire was too low, the whole skewer stayed limp and lukewarm, hiding cold flesh behind a veil of blackened edges. And sometimes, the meat wasn't meat at all. Organ scraps, pressed blood, or even mashed lentils mixed with lard were formed into balls and skewered to stretch supplies. In poorer districts, rats and birds weren't unheard of, especially when meat prices rose. You bought a skewer, bit in, and hoped not to recognize the shape or taste of what was inside. Vendors reused their sticks. They soaked them in water overnight to prevent burning, but rarely cleaned them. Bits of char clung to the ends. Some skewers cracked and splintered with repeated use, leaving tiny shards in the meat. Flies landed freely on uncooked portions, and no one had cloths clean enough to wipe them away. The rush of market day didn't help. Cooks worked fast. Dropped meat was picked up, dusted off, and put back. If a skewer fell into ash, it was shaken, reheated, and served. People didn't ask questions. They didn't want to. The hunger in their bellies was louder than the doubts in their minds. Children loved skewers. So did workers. So did thieves who could grab one and disappear into the crowd. The food was hot, the stick disposable, and the mess minimal. It was perfect if you didn't think too hard. But later, many paid the price. Upset stomachs, fevers, worse. There were no recipes, no standard portions. One skewer might hold 5 tight chunks of meat, the next only 3, half fat and bone. You paid the same for both. The vendor smiled either way. On festival days, skewers multiplied. Dozens lined up, meat smoking in rows. The smell overwhelmed the street. But the meat had often been purchased in bulk days earlier, stored in sacks with salt, or hung in sheds where the air was thick and still. When cooked, it sizzled. When cooled, it smelled wrong. Still, the line never ended. Now, imagine the last of the skewers turning on the fire, the coals fading, the crowd thinning, the grease has cooled, the stick discarded. Whatever was eaten is already forgotten, or soon will be. Let that image pass. Let the scent drift away. Let the hunger fade. There are no skewers here, just silence. We continue. Mondays in a medieval town had their own rhythm. The fires were stoked slowly, the streets quieter than usual, and the market stalls, while open, were stocked with leftovers. But one thing never failed to appear in abundance: pies. Not the golden, buttery pies of modern kitchens, but rough, dense, hand-formed crusts filled with whatever hadn't spoiled over the weekend. Meat pies, vegetable pies, even sweet pies on rare occasions. They looked promising, sealed tight with a folded edge, sometimes marked with a cross or swirl to suggest what might be inside. But the truth was, even the baker wasn't always sure. These were the pies of Monday. Made quickly, sold cheaply, and filled with mystery. The crust itself was rarely pleasant. Thick and floury, baked until brittle, it was more of a container than a dish. In many kitchens, the crusts were reused from day to day. Some were baked with the specific intention of being inedible. They were called coffins, and not without reason. They sealed the contents in darkness and heat, hiding the truth until the first bite. And what lay inside? Sometimes it was meat, but not fresh cuts. These were offcuts, sinew and fat, bits boiled the day before and stewed again that morning. The meat was often minced with onion or garlic, heavily salted, sometimes even smoked over a low fire to dry it out before mixing. If the pie smelled strong, the baker might dust the top with a pinch of crushed herbs, or smear a bit of lard on the crust to make it shine. If it didn't smell at all, you were already suspicious. Vegetable pies were just as vague. Peas, turnips, leeks, wild greens, some mixed with stale cheese or mashed beans. Some had eggs that were close to turning. All of it cooked until the texture vanished, and the flavour blurred into something vaguely earthy, vaguely sour. Sweet pies were rarer, and usually reserved for those with a few extra coins. They might contain apples, dried plums, or bits of quince soaked in honey or wine, but even these could be disappointing. The fruit might be too dry, the crust too hard, the spices, if used at all, unevenly scattered or burned into bitterness. Some pies pretended to be sweet, but were filled with clotted milk and old nuts. You never knew until the crust cracked open. The biggest risk was not what you saw, but what you didn't. In the effort to save money and prevent waste, bakers often reused fillings from previous days. Pies that hadn't sold on Sunday were unwrapped, reheated, and mixed into Monday's batch. A bit of spoiled meat could be cut out, a questionable egg whisked in, a moldy crust scraped and reshaped. Nothing was wasted if it could be hidden. And so, every pie became a puzzle, a gamble. Some people bought the same kind each week, swearing by a particular baker's touch. Others picked at the crust carefully, sniffed the steam, then made a decision. A few bold souls bit in with full confidence. Most chewed slowly, uncertain if the texture meant overcooked lentil or undercooked liver. There were no labels, no warnings. The only guarantee was the heat of the fire, and that too varied from oven to oven. On rare occasions, a pie caused sickness, quietly, a fever, a night of stomach cramps. Once in a while, word spread of someone who died after eating one, but those stories faded quickly. People were hungry, pies were cheap, and Mondays always came again. Now imagine the last pie cooling on the baker's shelf, its crust cracked slightly, the filling leaking at the corner. Someone will buy it. Someone will eat it. But not you. Not tonight. Let the scent of flour and fat dissolve. Let the heat from the hearth die down. The bakery is closed, the streets are silent, and the pie, whatever it was, has disappeared into memory. Let's continue. The medieval alehouse was not just a place to drink. It was a gathering spot, a gossip hub, a shelter from rain and routine. In the warm shadow of flickering candlelight, voices rose and fell over mugs of ale, while dogs slept under benches and smoke hung low above the heads of the crowd. But there was one more reason people came, especially the poor, the tired, and the hungry. Free food. Not meals, not feasts, but little offerings left on the counter or tucked into wooden bowls. Bits of bread, bowls of beans, a slice of salted meat, the alehouse appetizer. At first glance, it felt like generosity. You ordered a pint, and along with it came a small plate of something to nibble. It made the ale taste better. It lined the stomach. It felt like hospitality. But it was never really free. Most of these snacks were leftovers. Crusts of bread from the night before, hard and curling at the edges. Bits of cheese cut from the rind. Sausage slices, dry and waxy, stacked beside old pickles that had turned soft in the brine. Sometimes you got salted peas or roasted chickpeas, scorched and bitter from the hearth. If meat was served, it was never the good kind. Scraps of pork rind, cooled and rubbery. Slivers of smoked fish, heavy with salt and barely chewable. Liver pâté, if you could call it that, pressed into a wooden dish and already darkening at the corners. The alehouse keeper knew what they were doing. These salty, dry or spicy foods made you thirsty. You drank more. You ordered another round. And by the time you realized the food was less than edible, you were too far into your second cup to care. Nothing was wasted. Stale loaves were sliced thin and toasted by the fire. Mold was scraped off with a knife. Cheese too soft to serve was mashed and mixed with herbs, or even beer, and spread on bread like a paste. It filled the mouth and masked the fact that it was already well past its best. And the bowls. Communal, rarely cleaned, passed from hand to hand. You reached in, found a bean, and hoped no one before you had coughed into the dish. Spoons, if provided, were often greasy, and cloth napkins, if they existed, were stiff with use. Sometimes, a patron would complain. The bread was too hard, the fish too sharp, but the alehouse keeper would smile and shrug. It was free, after all. Still, people ate it. After a long day in the fields or on the road, a warm room and a bite of anything felt like kindness. And sometimes, when the fire was right and the ale was strong, the food tasted better than it was. Memory softened the edges. Even stomachaches the next morning felt distant, almost worth it. There were regulars who swore by a certain house's garlic beans or another's hard-boiled eggs, served in cracked bowls and sprinkled with ash. They knew it wasn't fine eating. That wasn't the point. It was about comfort, habit, heat. But behind the scenes, the food told a story of waste transformed, of corners cut, of food served not out of care, but calculation. And now the alehouse is closing. The candles burn low. The bowls are empty, the bread gone dry. The drinkers stumble home. the benches creak no more. Let that place fade. Let the salt and smoke leave your mouth. The free food is behind you, and the price is no longer yours to pay. Let's move on. Before there were meat pies, before fried skewers or festival fritters, there was pottage. It was not flashy. It did not sizzle. It did not sparkle on feast day platters. But for centuries, it was the dish that fed everyone. Day after day, year after year. Pottage was less a recipe than a routine. A pot, a bit of water, some grain, and whatever else could be found. It simmered low and long, thickening slowly into something between soup and stew. Sometimes it was hot, sometimes it was sour, sometimes it was barely more than flavoured water with lumps. There was no one kind of pottage. It shifted with the seasons. In spring, there might be wild greens, nettles, or early peas. In autumn, beans, onions, bits of cabbage. In winter, dried lentils, crushed barley, and salt. Always salt. Grain formed the base. Oats, or rye, or wheat, depending on where you lived. The grain gave body, turning the thin broth into a kind of paste that stuck to the spoon and to the ribs. Vegetables came next, but not the best parts. Carrot tops, turnip peels, wilted leeks. Nothing was wasted, and little was fresh. If you were lucky, a bit of meat found its way in, a bone left from yesterday's roast, a scrap of bacon, a sliver of salted fish, enough to give the pot a scent, if not real flavour. Those with more to spare added herbs, garlic, maybe a pinch of ground mustard. Those without added more water. And that water, drawn from wells or rivers, often cloudy, sometimes tepid, boiling helped, but did not fix everything. A pot that simmered for hours became thick, yes, but also soured if left too long, and many pottage pots were never truly cleaned. The next day's meal was made by simply adding more to the same pot. More grain, more water, more whatever was available. By the third or fourth day, what was once food had become sludge, the flavours indistinct, the texture slippery, yet it was still eaten, because it was there, because it filled the stomach, because there were no other options. In monasteries, pottage was served in silence. In castles, it appeared as a first course for the servants. In cottages, it was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Children grew up on it. Elders relied on it. It was cheap, adaptable, and forgiving of failure. But it was not loved. People tolerated pottage. They joked about it, sighed over it, and dreamed of meals that were not pottage. Even the name wore thin. Some called it slop, others mash. In some places, the pot itself took on a nickname, passed down like an heirloom, bubbling constantly with whatever scraps the family could gather. And yet, there was something oddly enduring about it. A mother stirring it with one hand while rocking a baby with the other. A field hand returning at dusk to find the same pot still warm. A monk hunched over his bowl, grateful not for taste, but for fullness. Some recipes survive. Ancient texts list ingredients and instructions, as if precision could make it delicious. But the truth is, most pottage tasted the same. Damp grain, overcooked greens, salt. Occasionally, a burst of something unexpected. A bit of plum, a spoonful of fat, a twig of rosemary that hadn't been chewed properly. And then, just like that, it was gone, scraped from the pot, swallowed without ceremony, forgotten until the next mealtime. So tonight, let it fade. Let the pot go quiet. The fire underneath has died. The spoon rests on the table. The slop has settled. There is no more chewing to be done. You are not there, not stirring, not swallowing. The pottage belongs to another time. And now, we move forward. The sun has long since set. The market stalls are shuttered. The bakers' ovens have gone cold, but in the corners of the medieval town, small fires still burn, low, flickering. And over them, something simmers. Midnight food. Not meant for the noble or the careful. These were meals for the restless, for the watchman pacing the town wall, for the drunkards swaying home from alehouses, for the hungry poor who had saved one coin for one bite. These were the meals sold in silence, traded under torchlight, cooked quickly, and often regretted just as fast. Vendors worked from carts or doorways. No signs, no menus, just the smell of grease, the glint of steam, and the vague promise of warmth. You handed over your coin and hoped for something edible, maybe something hot, maybe something that wouldn't wake you later with pain in your belly and regret on your breath. The most common offering was soup, thin, grey, and uncertain, made from bones that had already been boiled twice, or from yesterday's pottage stretched with more water. The meat inside, if there was any, had no name. A lump, a shadow, a chew that ended too quickly or lasted far too long. Bread might be served with it, hard as stone and soaked in broth until it turned to mush. Other stalls offered fried cakes, flattened dough, thrown into bubbling fat and turned once, then again. The oil was old. It had been used all day, and perhaps the day before. Smoke clung to it. Bits of burnt batter floated in it. The cakes were greasy and warm and tasted faintly of everything that had come before. Some vendors offered roasted meat, but not fresh. Cold cuts from the afternoon's feast, warmed over fire until the fat began to melt again. Sausage ends, curled and shriveled. Chicken wings blackened at the tips. Ribs stripped down to bone and served with vinegar or salt. Anything to hide the fact that they had sat in a bucket for hours. Eggs were popular. Boiled earlier and left in a bowl, they were reheated in water or fire. The yolks green, the whites rubbery. If you peeled one, the shell sometimes stuck to the flesh, and when you bit in, the flavour was sharp, sulphurous, and oddly metallic. Still, they were easy to carry, easy to eat. No one asked where the food came from. No one wanted to know. A pie might have sat out since morning. A stew might be on its third reheating. Vendors did not throw things away. They sold what was left. And at night, in the quiet, people were less picky. Some places even offered specials for those who came late. A mixed plate of scraps, often served with ale or warm cider. The scraps were cold. The drink was lukewarm. Together, they filled the belly and dulled the tongue. And for a little while, that was enough. But not always. Many awoke the next morning with cramps, fevers, or worse. The stew had turned. The meat was spoiled. The bread carried mould too old to see by torchlight. Some blamed the ale. Some blamed the weather. Few blamed the meal. Because hunger, in the middle of the night, makes strange choices seem reasonable. There were stories. A soldier who ate a midnight pie and never rose from bed again. A child who licked honey from a spoon, left out too long, and burned with fever for 3 days. But the stalls stayed open. The fires stayed lit, and people kept coming. So now, the streets are empty again. The bowls are stacked, the fat has cooled. Whatever was cooking has been scraped away or left to harden in the pan. The vendors have vanished into shadow. Let that scene go. Let the hunger fade. Let your mouth stay clean, your breath steady, your sleep undisturbed. No midnight meals tonight. Let's continue. There were days when meat was forbidden. Days marked in red ink on the church calendar, when bells rang not for feasting, but for fasting. Lent, Fridays, holy vigils. Days when flesh was set aside, and the soul was to be sharpened through denial. But people still had to eat. And so, they turned to fish. It sounds noble in theory. A shift from indulgence to simplicity. A meal in line with devotion. But in practice, fasting food became its own strange economy. And the fish, the pies, the mock meats, and mysterious stews made for these days were often just as questionable as anything served on an ordinary Tuesday. Salt fish was the most common. Cod or herring, packed in barrels and salted until no flavor remained except salt itself. It arrived in towns hard as wood, white at the edges, flaking when tapped. To prepare it, the fish had to be soaked for hours, sometimes overnight, then boiled, then stewed again. The result was still tough, still salty, but technically edible, barely. Some cooks tried to disguise the saltiness with sauces, mustard, vinegar, honey. But all it did was confuse the tongue further. You could chew for minutes and still not know exactly what you were eating. The fish taste never truly faded. It lingered, even in your breath, even in your dreams. Fresh fish was expensive, reserved for the rich or those who lived near rivers. But even these could disappoint. A trout left out too long, an eel slimy to the touch. Vendors sometimes sold the same fish twice, rubbing it with lemon or herbs to hide the smell. Some cooked fish so heavily it fell apart on the plate. Others served it raw, salted beyond recognition, wrapped in cabbage or pastry to fake complexity. Then there were the imposters. Fish pies that contained no fish. Vegetable stews thickened with lard or marrow. Egg puddings made with broth from boiled bones. Some sellers took advantage of fasting rules, knowing that few would question a dish too closely. If it looked like fish, if it smelled faintly of the sea, it was good enough. There were even meat dishes disguised as fish, or fish shaped like birds. Monks wrote elaborate recipes for creating the illusion of meat using almond milk, breadcrumbs, and fish paste. In royal courts, entire mock roasts were assembled, crafted from fasting-approved ingredients to mimic the real thing. But outside those rare kitchens, the trickery was more crude. In crowded markets, bowls of what looked like lentils were sometimes studded with bits of fat. Porridge was stirred with greasy spoons. Oil used for frying fish had already been used to cook meat, again and again. A devout customer might follow the rules to the letter and still end the day with something very far from holy in their belly. Even eggs were debated. Some claimed they counted as flesh. Others said they were pure enough for fasting. Vendors sold pickled eggs in jars, weeks old, floating in brine darkened with herbs and onion peel. The eggs were soft, rubbery, with yolks that sometimes smelled of sulfur or worse. Cheese, too, was slippery territory, allowed by some, forbidden by others. But it was often so heavily salted, so hard from long storage, that even the most enthusiastic believer found it hard to chew, let alone enjoy. And yet, people still sought out variety. Even in restriction, they wanted comfort, something warm, something flavorful, something that didn't feel like punishment. But fasting food rarely delivered. It was either bland or suspiciously rich, either too much salt or none at all, either dry or strangely wet. The line between piety and indigestion was thinner than anyone liked to admit. So now, the fast is over. The plates are cleared, the fish has crumbled, the pie crusts have collapsed. There is nothing left but the faint memory of something that smelled like vinegar and tasted like the sea. Let that memory fade. Let the salt wash away. The rules of fasting no longer apply. Let's continue. You've walked through crowded markets, sat beside smoky fires, tasted pies filled with mystery, and watched bread crumble into dry crumbs or dissolve into salty broth. You've heard the hiss of old oil, the clink of reused spoons, the whispers of cooks stirring pots they never truly cleaned. And through it all, one question quietly lingers. If it was all so bad, why did people keep eating it? The truth is simple. Because they had to. Because hunger speaks louder than caution. Because in the long arc of history, comfort is rarely about perfection. It's about availability, warmth, the weight of something in your hand when your belly has been empty too long. Medieval junk food, for all its flaws, served a purpose. It was fast. It was filling. It was there. The meat pie might be dry or spoiled, but it was portable. The sausage might be stringy or sour, but it gave you protein when nothing else did. The bread might break your teeth, but it held stew and soaked up broth. Even the strange sweets and questionable skewers had their place. They added texture to a world where choice was limited and pleasure was fleeting. And behind each bite was labor, a butcher trimming scraps, a cook watching flames by lamplight, a mother stretching flour to feed 5 mouths. No one called it junk. No one had the luxury of labels. Food was food. Whatever its taste, whatever its origin, it was part of life, and life needed fuel. Today, we look back and shake our heads. We grimace at the thought of pottage left simmering for a week, or eggs boiled in ash. We're used to labels and safety checks, expiration dates, and clean kitchens. But in many places, even now, fast food is still a compromise. Still cheap, still inconsistent, still eaten not for joy, but for survival. The legacy of medieval junk food is not in its recipes, most of which were never written down. It's in the rhythm of eating when there's little time, in the habit of filling the stomach before the soul, in the quiet understanding that sometimes taste comes second to need. And yet, even among the grease and grit, there were moments of grace. A warm skewer on a cold night, a soft fritter shared with a friend, a sweet bite that lingered longer than expected. These small joys, however fleeting, were real. They made the hard years softer, the hard days endurable. Now the markets are closed, the vendors gone, the oil cooled, the salt rinsed clean. The junk food of the past lies behind us, tucked into the folds of memory and time. You are no longer walking the muddy streets, no longer weighing a coin in your hand, deciding if a crust is worth the risk. You are still, full, safe. Let the smoke clear, let the noise fall silent, let the story come to rest, and sleep well.